There is a family in southern Louisiana that has told the same story for 200 years. French blood. That is what they say. Proud French settlers who came down the Mississippi before the United States even existed. They have the surname to prove it. They have the parish records. They have the photographs of serious-faced ancestors with European features hanging in hallways, watching the next generation grow up with the same story in their ears. Then, 3 years ago, one of the grandchildren took a DNA test, and the story fell apart. Not a little. Not a few percentage points off. The genome came back showing ancestry that the family had never spoken of, had no record of, and in some cases had no language to even process. Significant West and Central African lineage. Indigenous American markers stronger than anything the written record suggested. And the European signal, the one they had built their entire identity around, split into pieces that did not quite add up the way anyone expected. The family was shaken. Some of them were angry. A few of them quietly understood. Because this is Louisiana. And in Louisiana, the story was always more complicated than anyone was allowed to say out loud. This is not a story about one family. This is a story about an entire population whose DNA does not read the way it should. A population that has been mixing, hiding, adapting, and surviving for 300 years, and whose genetic record has baffled researchers for the past 2 decades. They are called the Louisiana Creoles. And what their genomes are revealing right now is one of the most surprising ancestry mysteries in American history. Let's start with what everyone already knows, or thinks they know. Louisiana, before it became an American state, was not like anywhere else in North America. The French arrived first, in the early 1700s. They were traders, missionaries, settlers. They built posts along the bayous and the Mississippi Delta. They needed labor. They brought enslaved Africans. Then Spain took control for about 4 decades in the late 1700s. Spanish administrators, Spanish land grants, Spanish surnames layered over French ones. Then France briefly took it back. Then Napoleon sold the whole thing to the United States in 1803. Meanwhile, people were living there, mixing there, building lives under every one of those flags. Enslaved Africans were arriving through a slave trade with unusually specific ties to particular regions of West and Central Africa. Free people of color, a legal and social class that barely existed anywhere else in the American South, were building their own communities, owning property, and in some cases running plantations themselves. And the indigenous nations, the Chitimacha, the Huma, the Choctaw, and others, were already there. They did not simply vanish when Europeans arrived. What you had, by the early 1800s, was a collision of populations unlike almost anything else on the continent. And out of that collision came something distinct. A culture, a cuisine, a dialect, a music, an identity. Creole. Now, here is where the textbook explanation usually ends. And here is where the real mystery begins. The standard version of Creole history says this: French, Spanish, African, and Native American bloodlines mixed together in the colonial period. Over time, that mixing produced a distinct community with its own culture. Case closed. Historians accepted that framework for generations. Genealogists worked within it. Families told themselves that story and passed it down. But then genetic testing arrived, and the numbers started doing something strange. When researchers began sequencing the genomes of Louisiana Creole families and mapping those results against established ancestry reference populations, they expected to see a relatively predictable blend. Some West African ancestry, some European ancestry, weighted toward French and Iberian, a smaller amount of Native American ancestry, mixed in proportions that roughly reflected what the historical record suggested. That is not what they found. The African ancestry components did not cluster the way they do in other African American populations across the United States. Something was different about the source. The European components split in odd, specific ways, sometimes showing stronger Iberian signals than French ones, even in families with entirely French surnames and entirely French oral histories. And the indigenous American ancestry, when it appeared, was sometimes far stronger than any written document had ever suggested it should be. The genes were telling a different story than the paperwork. And here is the part that really caught researchers' attention. The discrepancy was not random noise. It was not just one anomalous family or one confused database entry. It was structured. It repeated across unrelated families in different parishes and different decades. That kind of pattern does not happen by accident. That kind of pattern means something systematic happened to the historical record, not just informal mixing that went undocumented. Deliberate distortion. To understand why the record was distorted, you have to understand what the record was measuring. Louisiana's racial classification system in the 18th and 19th centuries was unusually detailed. Not just black and white, not just free and enslaved. There were legal categories for people who were 1/8 African, 1/16, even smaller fractions. Specific legal terms, quadroon, octoroon, griff, that encoded ancestry with a precision that most of the rest of the country never bothered to formalize. On paper, this looks like thoroughness, like historical attention to detail. In practice, it was a machine that created enormous incentive to manipulate the record. Here is why. In Louisiana, which legal category you fell into determined almost everything about your life. A family that could document itself as Spanish rather than mixed race gained property protections, legal rights, the ability to make contracts, to inherit land, to exist in public life on a different level. In some cases, it meant the difference between freedom and enslavement. So people did what people always do when survival depends on a story. They changed the story. Baptismal records were altered. Spanish or French identity was claimed over African or indigenous identity, sometimes within a single generation. A mother entered one way in the parish ledger. A daughter entered differently years later, sometimes with the original entry crossed out and rewritten in different ink. And once that story was set, it was repeated. For a generation, then 2, then 5, until the families themselves believed it completely, until the grandchildren were taking it as fact, hanging the portraits, telling the story at dinner, and then getting a DNA test that quietly undid 2 centuries of careful maintenance. DNA does not know about any of that. DNA does not file paperwork. It does not respond to legal pressure. It does not care what word was scratched out in a church basement in 1846. And that is exactly why it has been able to surface something the archives were designed to hide. But here is the part that even experienced researchers were not fully prepared for. When population geneticists started comparing genome-wide data across Creole families, not just looking at surnames or self-reported ancestry, but analyzing hundreds of thousands of points across the entire genetic code, they found something that should not have been possible. The variation between families was enormous. Not a few percentage points, not the kind of ordinary genetic drift you would expect inside one community after several generations of intermarriage. Enormous. One family carrying ancestry that was overwhelmingly West Central African. A neighboring family living in the same town, attending the same church, sharing an almost identical French surname, carrying ancestry that was predominantly Iberian and indigenous, with comparatively little African signal at all. 2 families sharing a church pew, a language, a surname, a community identity, looking, on paper, like they came from entirely different corners of the Atlantic world. That should not happen in a population that has supposedly been intermarrying as a single group for 3 centuries. If Creole really were one blended community, ancestry proportions should average out across generations. They should start to look similar. The variation should compress, not stay sharp. Instead, the variation was staying sharp, distinct, almost as if several completely separate populations had been folded under one cultural label without ever fully genetically merging. That is the twist, and it changes the entire way you have to think about what Louisiana Creole actually was. The old framing said, one community, many bloodlines, blended over time. The genome says something different. Creole was never one bloodline pretending to be many identities. It was many bloodlines pretending, by legal necessity, to be one identity. The culture unified. The genome did not. And nobody was tracking that difference until sequencing technology made it visible. How that happened, why that happened, and what it means for thousands of families across Louisiana right now who are finding out that the story they were told and the story their DNA carries are 2 different things. That is what the rest of this video is going to show you. Because the science gets more specific, and the history gets darker, and the answer that finally emerges is not the one anyone expected. Stay with me. Let's go back to the record books. Because this is where the investigation actually starts. Not in a genetics lab, not in front of a computer screen running ancestry software. It starts in a room that smells like old paper and humidity, in the basement of a Louisiana parish church, where ledgers have been sitting on shelves since before the Civil War. Genealogists have been working these archives for decades, combing through baptismal records, marriage certificates, death registries, land grants, trying to trace family lines backward through time. And the experienced ones will tell you something that the casual researcher misses completely. The entries that are clean and consistent are not the interesting ones. The interesting ones are the entries where something was changed. Picture a ledger page from 1831. Faded brown ink. Careful handwriting, the kind of handwriting people used when paper was expensive and mistakes were permanent. A child's baptism. Name, date, parents listed, status recorded. And then, in different ink, darker, thicker, written at a different angle, a single word crossed out. Replaced. Sometimes the replacement was made years later, sometimes decades, sometimes the person who made the change is not even recorded. Just the evidence of a decision. A moment when someone picked up a pen and decided which version of the family's story would be the one that survived. Historians who have studied these documents describe seeing mulatra scratched through and replaced with blanc. Free-colored reclassified as simply free. Indigenous identifiers removed entirely, replaced with European surnames and European status categories. This was not careless record-keeping. This was not a clerk making an honest correction. This was survival strategy, executed deliberately, passed down as standard practice across generations. And here is the part that matters for understanding the DNA mystery. These alterations did not just change one family's paperwork. They changed how that family moved through the world from that moment forward. Who they were legally allowed to marry, what property they could hold, whether their children grew up inside one social circle or another. The altered record became the lived reality. And the lived reality shaped the genetics of every generation that followed. Now let's talk about the three theories. Because when genetic researchers started comparing Creole DNA results against the historical record and finding that the numbers did not line up, the scientific community did what it always does. It generated competing explanations. There are three main ones. All of them are partially correct. None of them alone closes the gap. The first theory is called the founder effect argument. This one says that the unusual ancestry patterns in Creole genomes come primarily from the very beginning. From the earliest colonial period, before racial categories hardened into legal weapons. Here is the logic. In the 1600s and very early 1700s, Louisiana was a frontier. Small populations, isolated settlements, French trappers and traders living alongside African workers and indigenous communities without the rigid classification system that came later. In those early decades, unions happened across what would later become legally enforced boundaries. A French settler and an enslaved African woman, a free man of color and an indigenous woman, a Spanish administrator and a free woman of color. The children of those unions became the founding families of the Creole community. And here is the key part. When a small founding population carries a particular genetic signal, that signal gets amplified over time. Every generation of relatively closed community marriage, marrying within the same group, the same parish, the same extended network, reinforces and concentrates whatever ancestry the founders carried. So under this theory, the strange signals in Creole DNA are not the result of mixing that happened across 3 centuries. They are the echo of a small number of unions that happened in one specific window of time, before anyone was watching closely enough to stop them. That is theory 1. Compelling. Supported by some of the data, but not the whole answer. The second theory focuses not on who was mixing, but on where the enslaved Africans were coming from. And this is where Louisiana becomes genuinely different from almost every other southern state. Most of the American South drew its enslaved population primarily from West Africa, the coast of modern Ghana, Benin, Nigeria. Specific cultural groups, Akan, Yoruba, Igbo, that dominate the African ancestry signals in most African American DNA across the country. Louisiana was different. Louisiana's slave trade had unusually direct and documented ties to Senegal and Gambia in the far northwest of West Africa, the Wolof and Mandinka populations, a culturally and genetically distinct source from what was feeding the rest of the South. Later, Louisiana also received significant numbers of enslaved people from Central Africa, from the Congo Basin and Angola, again a different genetic source population than most of the country. And then there was the Caribbean connection. Following the Haitian Revolution of the early 1800s, a documented wave of refugees arrived in New Orleans. Free people of color, enslaved people, and white colonists alike, all fleeing Saint-Domingue, the French colony that became modern Haiti. They brought with them a Caribbean genetic signature that had already gone through its own mixing process on the island. What this means is that when you look at the African ancestry components in Louisiana Creole DNA, you are not looking at one thing. You are looking at least three distinct source populations: Senegambian, Central African, and Caribbean, each with different genetic profiles layered into the same community. That is why Creole African ancestry does not cluster the way African American ancestry does elsewhere in the country. It is not a different amount of mixing. It is a fundamentally different set of source populations. Theory 2 explains a significant portion of the mystery, but it still does not account for the indigenous component, and it does not explain the sharp variation between neighboring families. The third theory is the one that historians find most uncomfortable, because it requires acknowledging something that the colonial legal system spent enormous energy trying to erase: the Native American ancestry hidden in the record. Here is the documented reality. The indigenous nations of Louisiana, the Huma, the Chitimacha, the Choctaw, the Natchez, and others, were not passive observers of colonial settlement. They were active participants in the economy, the politics, and the social life of the region. Trade relationships existed from the earliest French contact. Intermarriage happened. Communities overlapped. But indigenous identity in colonial Louisiana came with a specific and brutal legal disadvantage. There was no legal category of free indigenous person that carried the same protections as free person of color. In fact, indigenous ancestry, in many periods, was more legally dangerous than African ancestry. The colonial system was actively working to eliminate indigenous land claims, indigenous community structures, and indigenous identity markers, which means that for a family with indigenous ancestry, claiming that ancestry in a legal document was actively harmful. It gave you fewer rights, not more. It made your property less secure. It made your children more vulnerable, so families hid it. Not all at once, gradually, one generation claiming a Spanish grandmother instead of a Choctaw one. The next generation with no record of indigenous ancestry at all. The next generation genuinely believing the Spanish story because that is the only story anyone told them. And the DNA, 3 generations later, 5 generations later, still carries the signal of the Choctaw grandmother. Quietly, persistently, waiting for someone to look. When researchers run genome-wide analysis on Creole families today and compare those results against indigenous American reference populations, they find ancestry levels that are significantly higher than anything the written record prepared them for. Not in every family, but consistently enough across enough unrelated households that it cannot be explained as error. The indigenous ancestry was there, the record was built to erase it, and the genome held onto it anyway. So you have 3 theories: founder effect, distinct African source populations, erased indigenous ancestry. Each one explains a piece, none of them alone closes the case. And the researchers who have been sitting with this question for years are now starting to think that is actually the correct conclusion. Not a failure to find the answer itself. The Louisiana Creole genetic mystery is not one mystery. It is at least 3 separate historical processes happening simultaneously, each one producing its own distortion in the record, each one leaving its own signature in the genome. A founding period mixing event, amplified by generations of closed community marriage. A uniquely diverse African source population drawn from regions the rest of the South never touched. An indigenous ancestry layer so thoroughly erased from the legal record that entire family lines forgot it existed. All three happening at once, in the same parishes, in the same communities, in some cases in the same extended families. That is why the numbers look the way they do. That is why two families sharing a church pew can carry genomes that look like they came from different continents. Because in a sense, they did. And the legal system that forced them to call themselves the same thing also forced them to stop talking to each other about where they actually came from. But here is the part that the data cannot fully explain on its own. The part that requires you to think not just about genomes, but about human beings making choices under pressure. Think about what it actually felt like to hold that pen in 1831. You are a parent, you have a child being baptized, a clerk is writing in the ledger, and you know, because everyone in that parish knows, that the word he writes next to your family's name will follow your child through their entire life, will determine whether they can own land in their own name, whether they can marry the person they choose, whether they are legally free in a way that cannot be challenged. And you know that one word is safer than another word. What do? You do what every parent in every century has done when the law is working against their child. You choose the word that keeps them safest. You tell the story that protects them. And then you make sure your child knows to tell that same story. And you pray that your grandchildren never have to know why. That is not fraud. That is not deception for personal gain. That is the most human possible response to an inhuman system. And it is the reason why, 200 years later, a grandchild sits with a DNA result in their hands and feels the ground shift under everything they thought they knew about themselves. Here is the finding that changed everything. Not the three-theory framework, not the founder effect, not the slave trade routes, not the erased indigenous ancestry. Those were pieces, important pieces. But they were still working inside the old assumption that Louisiana Creoles were one community that mixed together and blended over time. The finding that broke that assumption open came from a series of population genetic studies published over the past 10 years. Studies that used genome-wide data, not a handful of ancestry markers, not a single saliva test. Hundreds of thousands of data points per person, mapped across the entire genetic code, compared against carefully built reference panels from West Africa, Central Africa, Iberia, France, and indigenous American populations. The researchers were not looking for what they found. They were expecting to confirm the blending hypothesis, to show that Creole ancestry had averaged out across generations into a recognizable shared profile. The kind of genetic signature you see in populations that have genuinely been intermarrying as one community for centuries. Instead, the data showed the opposite. The variation between families was not compressing. It was staying sharp. Household to household, in the same small towns, in the same parishes, among people who had been attending the same churches and speaking the same dialect for generations, the ancestry proportions were diverging rather than converging. One family, overwhelmingly West Central African ancestry, with smaller European and indigenous components. The family next door sharing an almost identical French surname, attending the same Mass, predominantly Iberian and indigenous, with comparatively little African signal at all. Not a few percentage points apart. Wide enough apart that on paper, mapped against global ancestry reference populations, these two neighboring families looked like they came from different corners of the Atlantic world. The researchers ran the numbers again, checked the methodology, expanded the sample size, the pattern held. So what was actually happening? To understand it, you have to go back to the colonial classification system. But this time, you have to look at it from a different angle. We already talked about how that system created incentive to falsify records, to claim European identity over African or indigenous identity, to scratch words out of ledgers and replace them with safer ones. But the system did something else too. Something that operated not through fraud, but through perfectly legal social pressure. It sorted people, not randomly, not gently, systematically. Generation after generation. Here is how it worked in practice. Free people of color in Louisiana existed on a legal spectrum. At one end, lighter-skinned families with documented European ancestry and property holdings had access to a set of rights and protections that gave them real stakes in the colonial economy. At the other end, Darker-skinned families with more visible African ancestry faced a completely different set of legal realities. More restrictions, less protection, more vulnerability to reclassification. Both groups existed under the same Creole cultural umbrella. Both spoke the same French-inflected dialect. Both attended Catholic Mass. Both cooked from the same culinary traditions. Both called themselves, in the broadest sense, part of the same community. But when it came to marriage, the single most consequential genetic event in any population, they were not choosing partners randomly from across the whole community. They were choosing partners strategically, because survival required it. Lighter-skinned families with documented status married within tightening circles, not because they were told to, because every generation that maintained that status protected the next generation's legal standing. Marrying outside that circle, marrying someone with more visible African ancestry or indigenous features, risked reclassification, risked losing property, risked losing freedom. Darker-skinned families facing a different set of restrictions formed their own tightening circles for their own survival reasons. Marrying within the community, keeping resources consolidated, protecting each other within the legal space available to them. Over time, not one generation, not two, but 5, 6, 7 generations, this created something that no one planned and no one announced. Parallel micro-populations, all living under the same Creole label, all sharing the same culture, the same language, the same cuisine, the same saints' days and funeral traditions and ways of cooking rice, but genetically diverging, not converging. The culture unified, the genome did not. And because no one was sequencing genomes in 1850, and because the legal system had every incentive to paper over the differences rather than document them, the divergence stayed invisible. Until now. This is the finding that reframes the entire mystery. Louisiana Creole was never one bloodline pretending to be many identities. It was many bloodlines, legally compelled to perform one identity, while quietly sorting themselves underneath that performance along genetic lines that the classification system itself had drawn. The mask was not just worn to fool outsiders. The mask became the shared culture. The music, the food, the language, the faith, all of that was real. All of that genuinely unified people across lines that the genome was simultaneously keeping distinct. You could sit at the same table, pray in the same church, bury your dead in the same cemetery, and carry a genome that had been diverging from your neighbors for 6 generations. Not because of hostility, not because of conscious separation, because a colonial legal system had made genetic convergence dangerous for everyone involved, in different ways, at the same time. Now let's talk about what this means for real families today. Because this is not an abstract academic finding, this is landing in people's living rooms right now. Consumer DNA testing has been available in its current form for roughly 15 years. In that time, the number of people who have taken ancestry tests has reached into the hundreds of millions globally. And within Louisiana Creole communities specifically, the uptake has been significant. People who grew up with one story are getting results that tell a different one. And the responses vary enormously, because the results are landing inside families that have been carrying these hidden histories for 200 years, and nobody prepared them for what opening that door might feel like. Some families find confirmation, a DNA result that roughly matches what the oral history always suggested, filling in details but not overturning anything fundamental. Those families tend to receive the results with interest and move on. Other families find something harder to process. A woman in her 60s who grew up in a family that identified as white, with French Creole ancestry, takes a test and discovers significant West African ancestry that no one in her family ever acknowledged. She is not young. She grew up in a particular community with a particular understanding of who she was. The result does not change her life in a practical sense, but it changes something about the story she has always told herself. A man who grew up deeply proud of his African-American Creole heritage takes a test and discovers that his ancestry is nearly 60% Iberian European. He knew there was European ancestry somewhere in the background. He did not expect it to be dominant. The result does not make him less of who he is, but it makes the history of how that ancestry got there, and why no one talked about it, suddenly very personal. A family that has been doing genealogical research for years, carefully tracing their French Creole line back to the 1700s, takes DNA tests and discovers indigenous ancestry strong enough to connect them to specific tribal reference populations. Nothing in the paper record ever suggested it. The paper record was built to hide it. These are not edge cases. These are happening across Louisiana in significant numbers. And the genetic counselors and genealogists who work with these families describe the same pattern repeatedly. The hardest part is not the ancestry itself. The hardest part is the realization of why it was hidden, and what that hiding cost. Because here is what the hiding cost. Every family that altered a baptismal record to survive, every family that chose the safer word, claimed the European grandmother, buried the Choctaw great-great-aunt in an unmarked place in the family story, paid a price that went beyond paperwork. They lost the ability to pass down the full truth of who they were, not because they wanted to lie to their children, because the law made the truth dangerous, because the truth, spoken aloud at the wrong moment, in the wrong document, could mean losing land, losing freedom, losing everything. So they made the calculation every parent makes when the system is working against their children. They chose protection over honesty. They chose survival over memory. And 200 years later, the grandchildren are sitting with DNA results that are asking them to grieve something they never knew they lost. A grandmother they never knew existed. A cultural connection that was cut before anyone alive can remember it being whole. A part of the family story that was so thoroughly buried that even the family forgot to mourn it. This is what the genome is surfacing. Not just ancestry percentages, the shape of what the hiding cost. There is a tool that some genealogists and genetic researchers are now using to help Creole families navigate exactly this kind of discovery. It combines traditional genealogical research, the parish records, the land grants, the marriage certificates, with genome-wide DNA analysis and a cross-referencing system that can identify not just ancestry percentages, but probable geographic origin windows for specific genetic segments. In plain terms, it does not just tell you that you have West African ancestry. It can suggest which region of West Africa that ancestry likely came from, in which century it entered your family line, and in some cases, which specific migration event or historical moment it corresponds to. For families trying to understand results that contradict 200 years of family stories, this kind of specificity matters. It moves the conversation from your DNA says something different to here is what was happening in 1762 that explains why your DNA looks the way it does. That context does not make the discovery less difficult, but it makes it more meaningful. It turns a number on a screen into a piece of history that has a shape, a cause, a set of human decisions behind it. The link is in the description, but stay with me, because what comes next is what ties all of this together. There is a meeting that happens in New Orleans every year. It does not make national news. It does not have a celebrity keynote or a major sponsor. It is a gathering of Creole families, genealogists, genetic researchers, and tribal representatives from indigenous nations whose ancestors lived in Louisiana before the French ever arrived. They bring documents. They bring DNA results. They bring photographs of people whose names were scratched out of ledgers 200 years ago. And they talk about what to do with the truth now that the genome has finally made it impossible to pretend the truth does not exist. The first thing you notice is that nobody in that room is angry at their ancestors. That is the response most people assume will dominate when a community discovers that its origin story was built on hidden or altered records. Anger at the people who changed the documents. Betrayal. A sense of having been deceived across generations. That is not what dominates. What dominates is something quieter and more complicated. A kind of grief that does not have a clean target. Because the people who scratched out those words in the ledgers were not trying to harm their descendants. They were trying to protect their children from a legal system that was genuinely dangerous. They made the only calculation available to them. And they paid a price for it that they probably never fully understood themselves. The grief is for the loss. For the grandmother who had to become invisible. For the language that was not passed down because passing it down would have raised questions. For the songs and the ceremonies and the knowledge of which plants grew, along which bayou and what they were good for, all of it quietly set aside, generation by generation, because survival required it. That is what people in that room are mourning. Not a lie, A sacrifice, one that was never supposed to be permanent and somehow became permanent anyway. Now let's talk about what the DNA is actually doing to those communities in real time. Because the individual family discoveries are just the first wave. The second wave is collective, and it is already reshaping how Louisiana Creole communities understand themselves in ways that go well beyond genealogy. Start with the indigenous connection. When genetic studies began showing consistent Native American ancestry in Creole families, ancestry significantly stronger than the written record suggested, it opened a conversation that had been effectively closed for a century and a half. Several Louisiana Creole families have now begun the process of working with tribal nations, specifically the Huma and the Chitimacha, to document genealogical connections that were erased from the legal record during the colonial period. This is not a simple process. Tribal citizenship is not determined by a DNA percentage. It requires genealogical documentation, community connection, and a recognition by the tribe itself. The genome is not a membership card, but what the genome does is provide a starting point, a reason to ask the question, a way of saying to a family that has been told for 200 years that they have no indigenous ancestry, actually look again. Look at what the DNA is carrying, and then look at the record and ask why the record says something different. Some of those conversations have led to genealogical discoveries that paper research alone never would have uncovered. A great-great-grandmother listed as Spanish in every document, whose genetic profile connects specifically to Gulf Coast indigenous populations. A family surname that appears in both Creole records and Huma community records from the same parish in the same decade. A connection that makes perfect sense genetically, but was never visible through the written archive. The DNA is not replacing the documentary record. It is asking different questions of it. And in some cases, those questions are opening doors that have been sealed for generations. The African ancestry conversation is moving in a parallel direction. For decades, African American genealogy has faced a specific and devastating barrier. The records that documented enslaved people's lives before emancipation were primarily records of property, not people. A name, an age estimate, a price. The African origin, the specific region, the specific cultural group, the specific place on the continent was almost never recorded. It was not considered relevant information by the people keeping the records. The result is a genealogical wall that most African American families hit somewhere between 1860 and 1865. The paper trail ends at emancipation. Before that, darkness. For Louisiana Creole families with West African ancestry, the genome is beginning to offer something that the paper record never could. Not names, not specific villages, but regional origin windows, genetic signatures that connect specific ancestry segments to specific populations in Senegambia, in the Congo Basin, in coastal Benin, with a precision that gets more refined every year as reference population databases expand. This is not a complete answer. A regional origin is not an identity. Knowing that a specific segment of your DNA traces to the Wolof populations of modern Senegal does not tell you the name of the woman who carried it, or what her life was like, or what she lost when she was brought across the ocean. But it is something. In the absence of any other record, it is the only window that exists. And for families who have been living with that wall for generations, for whom the silence before 1865 has always felt like an amputation, having any window at all carries a weight that is difficult to describe from the outside. Then there is the European ancestry question, and this one is the most complicated of the three, because the Iberian signals that kept showing up in Creole DNA, stronger than the French signals in families with French surnames and French oral histories, those signals have their own story, one that connects Louisiana not just to Spain, but to a much older movement of people across the Atlantic world. Here is the piece that most popular accounts of Louisiana Creole history leave out entirely. Spain's colonial presence in Louisiana was not just administrative. It came with people. And a significant portion of the Spanish colonial population in Louisiana in the late 1700s were not from mainland Spain. They were from the Canary Islands, a specific group known as the Isleños, island people, who were recruited by the Spanish colonial government and brought to Louisiana in waves between 1778 and 1783. The Canary Islands sit off the northwest coast of Africa. Their population, by the time of Spanish colonization in the 1400s, was already a complex genetic mixture. Indigenous Berber people called the Guanche, sub-Saharan African ancestry from centuries of trans-Saharan trade, Arab ancestry from North African contact, and then waves of Spanish settlers layered on top, which means that when Isleño colonists arrived in Louisiana in the 1780s and began intermarrying with the existing Creole population, they brought with them a genetic signature that was already Atlantic in character, already a mixture, already carrying markers that standard European ancestry panels would read in unexpected ways. This is one of the reasons Creole genomes sometimes show Iberian signals that are heavier than expected, and African signals that appear in unexpected places, and ancestry components that do not map cleanly onto the standard categories of European, African, and Native American. The Atlantic world was already mixed before it arrived in Louisiana. Louisiana just kept mixing it further. So here is where we stand: 300 years of history, 3 separate distortion mechanisms in the written record, 3 distinct genetic source populations that most Americans have never connected to Louisiana, and a colonial classification system that, in trying to sort people into fixed legal categories, accidentally created the conditions for one of the most genetically complex communities on the continent. The Louisiana Creole genome is not mysterious because something strange happened there. It is mysterious because everything happened there, at the same time, over generations. And the legal system that was supposed to document it was also the system with the most incentive to hide it. The genome held all of it, every layer, every source population, every family that scratched out a word in a ledger, every grandmother who became Spanish on paper while staying herself in private, every generation that chose survival over memory and paid the price in silence. It held all of it, and it waited. It waited for sequencing technology to become precise enough to read it. It waited for reference populations to be documented carefully enough to interpret it. It waited for researchers to ask not just what the ancestry percentages were, but why they varied so sharply between neighbors, why the culture unified while the genome diverged, why the mask fit so well that even the people wearing it forgot it was there. And now, finally, we are reading it. Somewhere in Louisiana right now, there is a family sitting with a DNA result that does not match the story they were told. Maybe it is African ancestry that no one ever named. Maybe it is an indigenous connection that was erased before anyone living can remember it. Maybe it is a Canary Island grandfather hiding inside an Iberian percentage that nobody in the family ever thought to question. Whatever it is, the genome is holding out something that the archive was built to bury. Not a correction, not an accusation, something closer to a letter from a great-great-grandmother who never got to send it. I was here, the genome says. This is where I came from. This is what I carried. I could not tell you myself. But I left this for you anyway. The science read it. Now the families get to decide what to do with it. Think about the 3 hidden layers we uncovered in this video. The erased indigenous ancestry, the buried African origin story, the Canary Island genetic signature that arrived disguised as Spanish. Write in the comments which one of these 3 surprised you the most. Just write the number, 1, 2, or 3. No explanation needed unless you want to give one. I read every comment in the first 24 hours, and I want to know which layer landed hardest for you. If you know someone who has taken a DNA test and gotten results that confused them, results that did not match their family story, that brought up more questions than answers, send them this video. 1 share. That is all. Because what this video gives them is not just the Louisiana story. It is the framework for understanding why DNA and family history sometimes tell different things. And that framework might be exactly what they need to stop feeling like the result was a mistake and start understanding what it is actually showing them. Next week, I am going inside a story that makes the Louisiana case look straightforward. There is a community in the American Southwest that genetic researchers have been quietly studying for 15 years. A population whose ancestry results contain a signal that does not match any known reference population on Earth. Not a measurement error, not a database gap. a genuine genetic signature with no clean explanation in the current scientific literature. And there is an internal document from a federal research agency, dated 1991, that suggests someone in that agency knew this population existed and made a deliberate decision not to pursue the research further. Next week, you will want to be there.